Well, hello.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are calling in from. It's always fun to see some of the stats afterwards, and we get to see some people are dialing in at 6 a.m., like my colleague David Brossard, and then we get some people who are calling in from all the way out in Australia, which is awful time zone. The good news is this is being recorded, so for those of you who aren't able to join right now, I'm not even sure why I'm saying this, but for those of you who can't be joining right now, it is recorded and will be available on LinkedIn. Today I am excited. We're almost coming full circle back to the original trio who ran our first webinar about 8 months ago now. So I'm joined by these two handsome fellows, David Brossard and Mark Berg. I do love my maple syrup, but I will hand it over to Mark and David to give a quick intro.
Yeah, we were debating whether you were a hockey guy. We couldn't quite remember if hockey had a big place in your life or you managed to avoid the hockey dad
I'm
trap.
more into the maple syrup than the hockey. You
Yeah,
got
there
me
we
there.
go.
Yeah,
Stickier.
it's even in my
Um,
coffee right now.
and I forgot mine. Oh man. Okay, cancel the webinar. I gotta go get coffee. Anyway, I'm David. I'm the CTO at Axiomatics. Like Matt said, it's 6 a.m. for me. I'm out on the West Coast. Happy to be here. Happy to be here with Mark to talk about authorization. Mark, over to you.
All right, thanks, David and Matt. Obviously, I must be Mark. Um, I work with David at Axiomatics, and I will say I'm a little disappointed because David promised there'd be donuts available at this early morning webinar, and I don't see any.
They're going to ring the doorbell any minute now.
Okay.
I promise.
Now, looking at the time, we have 56 minutes. We've ended up consolidating, I'm going to say, some of the top questions that we hear about every day, every week, every month on a recurring basis. David, you are known to be a bit of a talker. So I am going to be keeping you honest as much as I can throughout this entire presentation. We've got 10 questions to go through, and I'm going to try to make sure that we're able to cover off all of them in detail, or the right amount of detail, so that we can get through all of them. And if there's time, we can even field a few extras from the audience. So that being said, let's jump right in.
Thanks, Matt. And me, a talker? Really? I'm
I know.
surprised.
Mark's face said it all when I said it. So
That was my doorbell ringing when the donuts showed up.
okay.
There we go.
So why aren't roles enough, David?
Well, that's a really good question. And that kind of reminds me of one of my favorite movies, being Don Malkovich. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend you go check it out. It's from the late 90s, if I remember correctly. And it's sort of semi-sci-fi or fantastical. It's a great movie, great actor as well. But the problem with roles is that they are very good at sort of organizing basic authorization checks. That's why role-based access control was invented back in the 90s, but they don't scale. They don't scale to the complexity of the environments that we have today, of the authorization use cases that we have today. They're identity centric. They don't look at the context of the authorization. And oftentimes what happens if you want to reach the level of granularity that you need for your authorization, you'll end up with something called role explosion. And role explosion is something that's, or explosions are fun in movies, but they're not really fun in real life, right? An example I like to give, and no, I'm not a talker. What are you saying? I'm taking up all the stuff and not letting Mark say anything. It is my right. One good example is if you're a bank and you're operating, 10 branches per state. There's 50 states, so that's 500 branches. You end up with 500 different roles. But the reality, I'm sorry, 500 roles just for the teller role. If you had 10 roles per branch per state, now you have 5,000 roles. You can see the explosion happening. I even forgot to blow it up. But if you had expressed authorization in terms of the basic attributes, not just the role. So say their role, of course, are they a teller, a manager, a branch janitor, and then maybe their location and maybe even their state location. Then you could actually have 10 business roles and then a branch identification number and then a state code. And with that, you could have written authorization that scales. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, I think that I definitely echo that. We're just working with. We just wrapped up a proof of concept with someone last week, and they're like, "Oh, we need to get everybody's roles in our system," and everyone on their side was just like, "Oh man, do we have to do that?" Because everyone just has so many. They have too many, hundreds or even thousands of roles, and that was one of the drivers of why they were looking at our solution, is to say, "Hey, we understand roles are causing us problems. What can we do to reduce our dependency on them?"
Yeah, another consequence of role explosion is you end up with artificial roles and you don't really know what those represent anymore. And so that creates issues when you want to provision roles, when you want to deprovision roles, and when you want to do access recertification. Matt, if you want to review my entitlements or my roles, and one of them says SAP underscore 123 underscore XYZ, how do you know what that means? So no,
You don't.
not only roles not enough, but they lead to very, very hard to understand situations.
Yeah. I think I'm not supposed to be one of the talkers, but one of my favorite quotes from one of our customers was that, for one, they had about 50,000 employees, and they said they had well over 80,000 roles. So at that point, you might as well just give each individual their own specific role that dictates who they are, and it becomes almost easier to manage. You end up with a David Brossard role. You end up with a Mark Berg role, which is absolutely crazy. But
I want to say it's very millennial, right? You each get your own role.
yes. But the real challenge there was for them. They say getting started with those first few roles was really easy. Bank teller, bank manager, whatever it might be. But it grows to that point that you were just mentioning, David, where it becomes too much that you don't know what every role is, and that management becomes almost too much.
And then and then just the name of the role gets so long because you're appending so many different factors on the name, location, weight, eye color, all these different things. And it just adds to the mess.
Yeah.
But yes, let's move on to why they aren't enough, even when you already have too many of them.
Yeah, so if we wanted to group all those reasons, Mark and I, in preparing for this webinar, we kind of came up with these 4 categories. They're not the only ones, right? But number 1, segregation of duty challenges with roles, right? If you have static roles, it's hard to do SOD. I have a great example of a customer about 10 years ago. That's actually before you joined, Mark, so it's way back then, where the customer had the notion of a manager and then a sales manager and then a sales rep. This was a retail company. And then they had the notion of a trainee sales manager. So they actually had some pretty decent roles in place. And then sales managers could give commissions to the sales reps, but managers did not get commission themselves. That was the way it was set up. However, the trainee sales manager was normally a sales rep, so could receive a commission. And because they were a trainee sales manager, they also had the right to give commission. And because there was no check in there for lack of being able to do a check, they could actually assign themselves a commission. You see the violation of segregation of duty. That particular customer, they realized that mistake, not because they had an IAM review, but because on a monthly basis or quarterly basis, they would do their top salesman based on the sum total of commission. And suddenly they saw this person that had like 10 times as many commission or as much commission as the next. And they were like, wow, we have a star seller. And then when they looked at the person, they realized, oh no, they're cheating. They're assigning themselves commissions that they shouldn't have assigned themselves. Had they had dynamic SOD, they could have written something along the lines of, if you're a sales manager or a trainee sales manager, you can assign someone a commission unless they are you. Right? So you could have done that relationship check and prevented that commission from happening.
Yeah, and I think that segues straight into like in my opinion, the biggest thing about roles is they can't describe a relationship.
Yep.
So like a role says, hey, you're a sales manager, and then in a legacy system, then downstream you assign permissions to that role. And that's part of the reason why we get role explosion. But if you wanted to say, hey, I want the owner of a document to read something, or a doctor can only view the medical records of their patients. That's what we mean by relationship here, right? There's something about the user that relates them to the resource, whether they're the owner of it, they're on the same team, they're in the same region. So a lot of times that becomes, hey, the user's email address is the same as the owner field on the medical record, and a role can't do that. Um, Otherwise, you'd be creating literally millions of roles, billions of roles.
Yep.
If you got millions of documents, you've got millions of roles to find the owner of each one, and you would just never be able to keep up.
And that leads us right into the scale challenge, which we already talked about, right? The role explosion issue, that to get the level of granularity that you need, you're tempted to create yet another role in your IAM system or your governance system, and you end up with, Matt, what you said about the customer earlier, that ratio of 1 to 8 in their case. I've heard 1 to 10, 1 employee to 10 roles. That's just crazy. And then to wrap it up, we have context. The inability for roles to account for context, the fact that roles are so egocentric, they only look at identity data and nothing else, right? Mark, you've seen context play out with customers. Like, what was the biggest thing that roles could not address?
Well, there was, I'll say, time, not just like time of day. Like, hey, you can only access something during your shift, say during a customer service representative, right? They have access to sensitive information, but that's a 24/7 operation. And you want to make sure that they're only accessing that information during their shift. And then there's been other cases where I guess I can say it had to do with a casino. And, if you were a high roller, you could access the high roller room and bring one guest in with you, but the guest had to enter within 10 minutes after you did. So that's another area where we used time and date and time date durations within our policies.
Cool. Thanks.
All right. So that one only took about 10 minutes, which means that we can get through 5 at this rate.
Or we can keep people for 120 minutes.
So we'll get through 5. All right. So the next one. Won't externalizing authorization cripple my system? What do you mean by that?
I mean, just to save time, we're gonna just say no and move on. I think it's just good enough of an answer. Of course, it won't cripple your system. No, but joke aside, the bottom line is there's no free lunch. The bottom line is there's a cost to everything, and there's a cost to not doing anything either, right? You would think that your existing app, the way it is, with its baked in security, its baked in authentication, its baked in authorization, you'd think that this is the optimal performance you could get out of your app. But the truth is it's not, right? If you have one big monolith, you don't really know which parts cost you how much. Is it the authorization check? Is it the app itself? Is it something else? When you start breaking down the monolith into, the word du jour is microservices. Du jour is French, Mark, by the way. Then you can actually measure the individual parts. You can actually optimize the individual parts and make the whole system more performant. And I think that is true of authorization. Yes, authorization can create more checks and therefore incur more cost, but actually it gives you an opportunity to measure and optimize.
Yeah, and I think the other thing there is, one, we also sometimes see people assuming that there is no current cost to their authorization just because they can't measure it. So external, like you said, David, you externalize it, now it's exposed. So now you can understand what the cost of that is. But there's also other benefits of externalizing that, is now you can ensure that your authorization requirements are consistently met across all your applications, instead of having to potentially, in some cases, recreate the authorization in each application that you have. especially if you haven't standardized on a language yet. You have to rewrite that authorization and custom code in different languages, which now begs the question of, hey, am I consistently applying this? Is one application going to be weaker than the other? So if you externalize it, they can all leverage that same externalized authorization platform, and it also delivers a single audit point.
So not only, sorry, go ahead, Matt.
No. I was already gonna get to takeaways. So back to you, David.
I mean, takeaways, measure. And if you want to measure your apps, you want to break down your apps, so decouple your apps. This, by the way, does not apply to just authorization. It applies to any function within the app. So decouple, break down the monolith. Once you've done that, you can actually measure the individual parts. Once you've done that, you can actually start looking at optimizing those parts if it's at all possible. In the case of authorization, there's a long list of things you can do to make authorization more efficient. And then when you do that, of course, you can actually reduce the overall cost, the overall performance constraints, and increase your performance, reduce the costs.
Perfect. So other than the fact that the hand here doesn't know how to hold a wrench, integrations. Where can customers integrate? What's the how can we make their lives easy?
That is a very good question. So before we dive into the different apps that you could possibly protect with externalized authorization, I want to point out that the architecture that NIST put out in their publication 800-162, the famous architecture that talks about PEP, PEP, PDP, PIP, and so on and so forth, the P star P, we sometimes call it, that theoretical architecture can be applied to pretty much anything in principle, to any layer in principle. Oftentimes we talk about authorization in the context of applications or APIs. So we're thinking, that top tier, if you want to think in terms of ISO stack, but there's nothing that would prevent you from applying the same architecture and the same principles to say network access control, even physical access control, if you wanted to, right? But for us at Axiomatics, and I think for the bulk of them, of the other companies in this field, we tend to focus on the following 5 points, right? And the lowest hanging fruit, which is therefore highest on my slide, is APIs and API gateways. Mark, what can you tell us about APIs and API gateways?
Yeah, it's definitely a very quick and easy and non-disruptive way to start externalizing authorization. So what we mean here is, so within the API gateway itself, instead of the API gateway simply forwarding that API request downstream to a microservice, the gateway itself can apply some authorization to it. For example, the gateway already knows, in most cases, already knows who the user is, right? It has their identity. It knows the URI path of what API family, what query statements are in that. And it can form an authorization request and say, hey, can Bob access this API? Or even further, can Bob access a particular resource ID, medical record, document, whatever that is, transaction, to the RPDP and authorize it right there and then at the API gateway level before it gets downstream within your environment. So it's kind of like putting a bouncer at the door. You just keep people out. You can keep the troublemakers from getting in your nightclub.
Sounds like you have a lot of experience with bouncers, Mark. The other thing I like with API gateways is that they protect APIs, as you said, of course, and those are usually extremely well-structured endpoints with very well-structured input and output documents, if you will. And so you can easily generate policies that correspond to that structure. It's a very easy way to get started. Now, of course, if we go past the APIs, you'll have homegrown apps, homegrown microservices, homegrown anything, really. And that's also something you can protect. When it's homegrown, you can use our SDKs, our authorization SDKs, to write authorization where it matters to you, and that reflects the use cases that you want to implement. That's a very easy thing to do. It requires more dev time than APIs and API gateways would, because through API gateways you can do configuration-driven authorization, but you have extremely good control. You can actually do fine-grained authorization from within your app to a level that would turn on or off features, or perhaps change the user experience in a UI if you have a UI in your application. So that's a great place to be. Now, beyond the app, behind every great app, there usually is a great database, Mark. How do we handle that? Like, what happens? Is there a way that you can filter data with when you externalize authorization?
So yeah, there definitely are, and there's a couple ways to do it. One way is we can go back to that API gateway example where we said we do authorization on the way in. So we can say, hey, can this user access this API? Yes. And then we have some choices here where within the microservice, within the microservice itself, it can conduct more authorization checks and say, oh, you were looking for documents or medical records. And then it can apply authorization to determine which one. So with our products, you can actually create what we call a data filter that can describe the conditions under which you can see information. Like, hey, you can only see documents that are the same country of origin as your citizenship. So it can create a filter that says where country equals USA or country equals Canada. So the microservice itself can apply these, or if you want to put more load on your API gateways, you can have them inspect data on the way out. So there's multiple ways that this can be achieved. And unfortunately, this is something we take on with a case-by-case basis.
Cool. And then to wrap it up, I know, Matt, you're keeping an eye on time. Other things we could integrate with are SAP, SharePoint, other off-the-shelf apps. It might be a case-by-case basis, as Mark just mentioned. When in doubt, just ask. There's always a way to tackle authorization for an app.
I absolutely love this slide. I'm going to just kind of boil it down in simple terms. For the most part, if there's a hook, we can integrate with it. That's the simple answer. Most modern apps now offer those hooks, so it makes it really easy. But this lays it out. And Mark, kind of going back to your comment a few slides back, externalizing the authorization from the app itself, obviously it doesn't break everything, but the other thing that it does is it starts to apply that consistent approach across all of these apps. So I like the way you guys have done this. We've got a couple questions actually before we move on.
Yep.
The first one is, have you seen or do you provide any tools to translate current access control logic to the policy-based approach you propose here?
So the other way around, converting the policies we have to target systems that cannot use a policy enforcement point, but do have an authorization framework that can be configured. Yeah, we've done that. We've done that in the past. It's something that we can do again moving forward. Probably something we'll look at on a case-by-case basis. But a great example of what we did in the past was converting Axiomatics authorization policies into Microsoft SDDL policies or DACL, I think, Dynamic Access Control Lists, which was a feature of Windows Server 2012, if I remember, where you could do fine-grained authorization on files and folders. That was actually quite cool. You could write policies in Axiomatics, translate them using one of our APIs, and provision them to Windows, and boom, you had fine-grained authorization within Windows, contextual authorization within Windows. That's a great example. One case that I've been looking at recently is applying the same mechanism, but translating to Microsoft conditional access policies that you then feed into Entra. That ultimately is making the control plane a policy orchestrator, because it's not just about authorization within Axiomatics and through the PEP PDP architecture, but it's also authorization natively within the target app through their own policy language. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing here that I think maybe what this person is asking. If the current method is very structured, then I'll say, yeah, there's might be something we can do to do that translation from how it's being done today into a policy base. But one thing we keep on running into is if we go back to roles, like our role can't define a relationship. So we have to start going through a discovery process and say, well, why are you putting these people in these roles? And then if we can say, hey, we put them in here because they're the owner of it, or they're in the same region, or they're in the same team, then we can take that and start creating policies with it. But a lot of times to go from to go 100% coverage from what you have into a policy, unless it's very well structured, that's something that does require a little bit of a work and a little bit of a discovery process.
Yeah, very well said. Sorry, David, I'm going to rewind you one more time.
Whoa.
Another question. And I think this one actually is tied to the previous page or previous question on here. But
yeah,
how do you test that the new method is consistent with how the old method performed? And I think what the question is really asking is kind of going back to the slide where we said no free lunch and externalizing is going to decouple. But how do we make sure that the performance between the old and the new are consistent?
Proper requirements definition, proper testing definition, running through a test harness that verifies that the authorization use cases you care about are put in place. By the way, you don't have to necessarily throw away all of the authorization you were doing before, depending on whether we're talking about decoupling for performance purposes or we're talking about role-based access control. We still need roles, right? So oftentimes when we come in, we add additional authorization checks. We don't necessarily remove the previous ones. But the bottom line is write the requirements that you're aiming for, write the acceptance tests that you're aiming for, and then run those tests. I think it's a bit like app development. There's this thing, test-driven development. You could do the same thing here for authorization, test-driven authorization development. TDAD. I'm going to print a T-shirt that says TDAD.
I hope you do, and I look forward to seeing it at Identiverse. All right. I'm actually going to stop you from going deeper into that question because I know we're going to be getting into testing in a few slides.
Yeah.
There are more questions about that one. So let's jump right into who writes the policies, and hopefully not Shakespeare.
No, Mark does.
Well, I was going to say, I know it's not Barry Manilow because he writes the songs that the whole world sings. But yeah, we get this question a lot, right? Who's going to write the policies? And in some organizations, it can be a little bit of a hot potato. The security team wants to pass it off to the business owner, or a developer wants to pass it off to the business owner. And I guess the short answer is, who writes the policies? Well, anybody and everybody. Each organization is a little bit different. One good thing, our solution isn't going to force you into one way. If you have business people who want to write policies, they can. We have tools for that. We have tools that are geared more towards a developer or someone like myself doing policy as code. And we've also sprinkled in a little bit of AI there to help the business people write policies. So in some cases, it is a group effort. In other cases, it's, hey, there's a single team that's responsible for it, or there's single teams of, say, more technically minded groups within each business owner group. And then all those policies get aggregated together and deployed to our system.
And I see we've got a great comment here on LinkedIn coming in. Surprised there is no security persona here. There can be. There totally can be. I would put them more in the business owner. There's different tiers, if you will, of business here. On this side, we're kind of focusing on the technical skill set. But then the other aspect you want to consider is how close you are to what it is you want to protect. So if you're really close to the app, generally speaking, it would be the product owner, the app owner, the developer of the app. But then moving up, you're going to have the compliance team and the audit teams that care about internal legislation, things that you might have put in place. Say if you're a car manufacturer X, you don't want to work with car manufacturer Y, so you may have some compliance policies around that. But then moving up, you might have the legal team or the external compliance team, and they worry about things like GDPR legislation or any kind of government legislation, and they want to make sure that you put those in place. And then, of course, ultimately, you have the IT security team that might want to say things like, in order to get access to any kind of data from within the corporate network, basic authentication is enough. But if you're accessing from home or a VPN or outside of the home country of the company, then you want to do MFA or you want to do passkey authentication, something like that, right? So yeah, the security team can absolutely be part of the requirements. They would be, what I just said, part of the requirements. They might not be the ones writing the actual policy. That might be delegated to the developer and the business owner. That also goes back to something Mark said. We can have two separate, at a very high level, two separate teams that write policies. The local team, let's call it. So like I said, the app owner or the developer of the app, and then global or cross-enterprise teams. Like I said, the compliance team, the security team, these are cross-enterprise teams. They're responsible for global requirements, not the specific requirements, right? So yes, absolutely. And one of the cool things of doing externalized authorization and doing it based on policies is you can have both happen at the same time, right? You can have a global policy that applies like a blanket across all of the apps, combined with a local policy that talks about that particular app only.
Right. I mean, we also see sometimes a security team, say, writes these global standard policies, or essentially they create a library of
Yep.
policy trees or even rules, and then they provide those to each individual business group and say, hey, here's a library of things that we wrote that you need to be using within your policies. Or like David said, that team can just overlay them on top of theirs and ensure those are being applied. So both models apply.
That was a really good question. Thanks for keeping us complete, because it is kind of missing on the slide.
I did
So-
say it, so at least I should get credit for at least saying it.
Mark, you always catch my bloopers and my mistakes and my oversights. Thanks for
It's a
being there.
It's a full-time job.
Donuts coming up. Oh yes, no doubt. And how much time do I need for those to write policies? Is it a time thing? Is it going to take me more time than what I would have done homegrown before?
Well, that's a different question than the one we have here. The one that we get more often is how much time do I spend maintaining them, which is after I've written my first batch. But to your point, when you first get started from scratch, just like any project, whether it's a project around the house or at work, sometimes you're a little bit slow getting started because you're not familiar with the tool set, or you have to do some prep work. But once you start getting a feel for things and start writing a couple of policies, it's kind of like a snowball going downhill. Things go quicker and quicker. But to the point of the question we get more often is, once I have one of these systems in place, how much time do I spend maintaining them? And most of the time, and someone's going to say, hey, this isn't the case for me, but most of the time, you spend very little time at all maintaining the policies. And that's because the policies are usually based on, say, some sort of compliance from the government or your own internal authorization requirements, essentially the rules of the land. And the rules don't change very often. You got to remember, we're not talking about, hey, I need to change a policy because someone's roles change, or someone got a promotion, right? Their titles change, or they've moved, they transferred to a different office. Those are values of user attributes, and those do not change the policy, because the policy, again, is checking relationships most of the time. Hey, are you the owner of the document? Are you on the same team? So just because your team changed doesn't mean the policy needs to change. So the policies typically stay pretty static.
I like to compare it to the traffic laws of wherever you drive, say a state or a province or a country. The driving laws generally do not change. The attributes of the driver and the attributes of the car and the location of the car, those change all the time, right? Yeah, your age changes, your ability to drive changes, the fines and the tickets you receive, of course, they might change. I mean, if you're a great driver like me and if you get tickets, I feel like I've just jinxed myself for the day now. But yes, the authorization is dynamic. The attributes change all the time. The result of evaluating a policy change, but the policies themselves don't change too much. And we got a great question, Matt, from the audience here.
Yeah, and I'll say, I'll start with this one. We would see this. Well, the question, in case I don't know if everyone can see the questions, but it was about policy sprawl. So we have seen people start with a role-based system because they have role explosion, and if you just lift and shift that to a policy base, then guess what? Yes, you have policy sprawl. So the goal here is to reduce the number of roles you have, right? Get rid of, hey, I've got a role sales manager Northeast for a particular product unit. Just do a role for sales and then use attributes to define the manager, the region, and which product line that they're responsible for. So yeah, if you just try to lift and shift one problem to another somewhere else, you're going to get it, right? If you've got too much clutter in your house and you get a storage unit, now you got a storage unit full of clutter, right? You didn't solve the problem.
Yeah, and to build on the second question that came in, that was regarding dynamic policy sets and setting and unsetting policies using shared signals, SSF shared signals framework, which is one of the frameworks we're involved in at OpenID. Yes, you could do that. I suppose you could, with shared signals, you can send signals to a system to do things, right? So one of those signals is called CAPE, C-A-E-P, and you could use that to, say, adapt an authorization token, an access token. So in principle, you could also apply that to policy. You could, receive a signal that a user's posture has changed, and therefore activate or deactivate a policy. But generally speaking, the way that we address this is through attributes. And a great use case that we've received time and time again, especially from insurance companies, is the following. You're a traditional accident home insurance company, and by default, your employees can only handle claims in their region. Now, that works great. You do that for security purposes, whatever the reasoning behind that policy is. But then one day, one of the regions gets flooded. Say you're in the States and Florida gets hit with a hurricane. People up in North Dakota, they're twiddling their thumbs because they don't have really any claims to handle in North Dakota. But people in the employees in Florida, they're swamped, no pun intended, with the claims coming in from the hurricane. Well, what if you had a policy that says, oh, in the case of an emergency, employees outside of the stricken region can handle claims in the stricken region to provide better customer service. So that is a policy that you can already have in place from the get-go. I would call that a break the glass policy. I would call that an emergency policy. And then what you need to do is introduce an attribute that will drive the activation or deactivation of said policy. In this case would be is region in an emergency state. And so that would give other claims processors, in my example, the ability to process claims for regions outside of their normal purview. So it's not the policy really itself that's dynamic. It gives that illusion, but it's driven through a dynamic attribute, which is even better because now you've thought of all the use cases beforehand. You know exactly how to react. You don't have to hastily write a policy to account for a new use case. You've thought of those use cases before.
Yeah, and maybe just as it's great to come up with the different scenarios and different policies that we could create. In a real world scenario with most of our customers, looking at the number of policies that they have, they're typically in the sub 100 policies to run their entire business. So that just hopefully will give you an idea as far as the policy sprawl. But
yes,
thank
absolutely.
you, David. We're looking at time. We've got 21 minutes. Can I trust the PEP? And what is a PEP?
Ooh, what is a PEP? Courage. Could be many different things. Energy. Policy enforcement points, right? The PEP is what protects the application. The PEP is what intercepts what's going in and out of the application. The PEP in the ABAC, I was mentioning NIST ABAC architecture. This is it, the famous slide. This is what starts the authorization check. And sometimes we get this question, well, can I trust the PEP to enforce the decision I'm giving it? How do I know it's going to do that thing? My answer typically is, well, you have to trust the PEP. There is implicit trust between the PEP and the PDP. If there isn't, how can you even trust the PEP to ask the right question, right? So you have to have that trust. All of these checks that we're doing, all of these are server-side checks. They're not client-side checks where there could be a malicious user or a script kiddie who would try to change what the PEP is doing. No, there has to be trust between the PEP and the PDP.
Yep.
Mark, anything you want to add on trust, Mark?
No, we can skip and move on to the next.
All righty. Oh, that's one of your favorite. I'll let you handle that one. What are advice and obligations for, dear Mark?
So obligations and advice, we won't get into what these are, but it's a way to provide additional information along with the decision that's coming back. So if you get a permit or deny decision, you can send additional information. One of the more common ways that we see obligations and advices used is to provide feedback to the end user itself. So instead of just flashing up a message that says access denied, to the user, you can provide additional information and say, hey, call this number, or you can provide some sort of a cryptic error code for them to call the service desk with. And we do have customers doing this. And the bottom line is you have to strike a balance. It really depends on the environment. Like if you're a consumer facing, you want to keep your customers happy, but you also want to keep them safe. If they struggle with your system, they're probably, maybe they'll go to a different vendor. So we do see in those cases more user-friendly error messages coming back. So you could tell them exactly why they were denied. It's like, hey, your citizenship is wrong, for example. Or you give them something cryptic. So it's a way to provide user feedback to make the user experience a little more enjoyable, if you will. And then there's our other things we can do with these to actually say enforce actions. So David, if you go to the next slide, these could be things that say, hey, you need to step up your authentication mechanism. Like, hey, you came in with a password, you need to use two-factor. So let's say, for example, in an investment situation, if you're transferring millions of dollars in funds, we want to say, hey, that password wasn't strong enough. Let's step up the authentication method. Or once someone has transferred all those funds, you can tell the PEP, hey, go send this message to the risk management system just so it's logged in real time. Granted, you can still get this information from our logs, but some people prefer the belt and suspenders approach. So you can use obligations to give instructions to the PEP of what actions it's supposed to do. And we also use them a lot for testing. We can embed obligations and advice within the policy and just use them for the sole purposes of testing, since in our world, the policy is a tree structure, meaning there's various branches and nodes where a decision could come from, and we can use obligations and advices as breadcrumbs in our test to understand that the decision came from the expected branch and the expected rule. So these are not things the end user sees. These are things that the DevOps teams would see.
So advice and obligations, they help us break away from the strictly binary yes-no decision model where all you get is a permit or a deny. You can actually add that contextual information in for a wide range of reasons, including, of course, enriching the user experience. Thanks. All right, one of my favorite ones here is knowing what's happening in your system. Who done it? This is a good story that I'm sure Sherlock Holmes or Dick Tracy would have loved to solve. But today we're actually going to solve it with two very simple things, right? But before we dive into, I'm sorry, Matt, I didn't let you ask the question, by the way.
No. If you want, I can do the answer in that case. But
please.
That's, kidding.
Reversal of roles. So yeah, when you say auditing, it could be two different things, right? It could be what happened. It could be what can happen. I'll do what happened. I'll let Mark do the what can happen. So the what happened in the monolith world, before you start externalizing authorization, you kind of rely on trying to make sense of the logs you have left and right. The app logs, maybe your proxy logs, your API gateway logs, but it's kind of hard to make sense of what is actually happening, what people are actually asking for, and what they're getting. With an externalized authorization service, with an externalized policy decision point, you get that PDP's audit log, and that audit log is going to contain the request that it received and the response it returned, and potentially additional information like which policies were used and how they were evaluated, and like a bunch of different varying degrees of metadata about the evaluation. But the bottom line is you can start building a couple of different things. First of all, you can start building the number of denies and the number of permits you got in the system. You could do some analytics of whether your system is under attack. If you see 1 million denies in the span of 1 second on a Sunday morning at 3 a.m. from the same user, you could start thinking that maybe that user is up to something no good, or maybe their credentials were stolen, right? So you can do a lot of these analysis. You could also do heat maps of which parts of your policies are being used and realize that some of your policies are never being used. And that could be an indication that you didn't really write good authorization policies to begin with, or it could be an indication that the particular use case that branch was protecting just never occurs. So it might be that your application no longer has that feature or is a seldom used feature, and that can give you insights into how you want to further develop your apps and APIs. So that's what can happen. Oh, sorry, what did happen, what happened. And really, I can't recommend enough that customers use SIEM tools, Splunk, ELK, whatever it may be, to analyze those logs, because they are a treasure trove of information. And that brings us to what can happen, Mark.
Right. So as opposed to in the what has happened, you're looking at logs. As when you get to what can happen, you're looking at the policy itself. So we can actually interrogate the policy and find out what it's capable of. What is it permitting? What is it denying? So we can ask questions like, what can Alice do? And then if you start automating this, right, you can ask about all your employees and all your customers. Now that list would get pretty long, but it's definitely possible to produce that information user by user. You can also ask, you say, based on a role, hey, what does an intern have access to? So you can look at that output, and if you find out the answer says, well, the intern can look at the company secrets, then you've got a problem in your policy, which you could also catch in testing. But again, there's also testing in layers, security in layers here. And you can turn these questions around and say, well, all right, who has access to company secrets? You can see the user characteristics. You can say, what actions can someone perform on the company secrets? You can turn this question around any way you want. But the point is, you're interrogating the policy to understand what it's allowing and what it's permitting. So it's a way to audit the policy itself.
Yeah, and it's something you can do in multiple stages, which brings us, Matt, to the following question.
Ooh, this is a good one, and it actually kind of brings us full circle back to an earlier question from the audience. But how do I test my policies? How do I effectively make sure that what I've built is going to behave the way that I want?
Well, there's different ways to do that. I think what Mark said just a minute ago, testing in depth is a really, really good one. What I said earlier as well, test-driven, my TDAD t-shirt idea, test-driven authorization development. I think that's really, really important. It's no different from writing code. And then, of course, you need tooling to actually do the testing. And there's roughly two ways you can test. One is through the traditional PEP PDP API. So you send a unit test, can Alice view record 1? You get a response back. You compare it to what you were expecting, and you know whether that is the right response. And like Mark just said, you could also use partial evaluation with the contextual authorization query to do these more open-ended questions like, oh, what can interns look at? Or who can view company secrets? Or is there any way an intern can view a company secret, right? So these are different ways to do testing. And one of our colleagues in the customer-facing team actually wrote a tool, maybe a couple of years ago now, which he quite rightly called the policy testing framework. It is actually a tool that is accessible on our GitHub, so that's where the QR code is going to take you to. And it helps you define tests and run through those tests. Mark, you've been using that tool more than I have. Can you give us a little bit more information how it works?
Yeah, so this could turn into an hour-long discussion, but essentially is it allows you to write a set of tests. So you can provide a set of attributes and provide what your expected response is, permit or deny, and you can also define what obligation and advices you're expecting to get back. You can say, hey, if given these attributes, I expect this result, and it gives you a pass-fail. You can do this with attribute connectors, or policy information points, or without. So you can take complete control of the values of the attributes. So it's a real great way. It's like, hey, once you make a change, you just rerun the test and make sure it's still behaving. You can run them in mass. You can get a little report like this that shows the results. And then it also provides tracing. So in here, we're showing that, hey, a test failed. And it also will help you understand why it failed. And I believe that's where we're headed next, is with the visual tracing of the policy tree. It can show you where it went, where the decision came from. So then you can quickly understand, it's like, oh, I expected a permit, but I got a deny on this test. You can understand why it failed really quickly.
Yeah, so the trace mark, it shows you a step-by-step, very detailed trace of how authorization was evaluated in the policy tree. And it tells us exactly where the eventual final decision came from, right? So it gives you an opportunity to troubleshoot that and understand what values were used in the decision making.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah, I think there's two points that I want to quickly make about this.
Yeah.
One is the fact that people start to ask questions like, well, I only have a handful of policies. Do I really need this? Well, when you only have that 5 to 10 policies or rules that you've got built in, it's pretty quick and easy to know that they're all having the right effect. But what happens is you go from 10 to 20, 20 to 30. How do you make sure that all those existing policies are still doing what they were meant for? This way, as your policies evolve, as your compliance standards change, as the security policies change, you're able to make sure that even if it is the 30th or 40th policy, they're all still giving you the behavior that you want. The other aspect is, again, your policies aren't just simple. If you're this user, you can have access to this. It really is that leaf and tree like structure that can really balloon over time in the complexity. Having this traced lets you really fine tune and get to the bottom of understanding your policy to make sure that, again, you are getting that expected behavior. But we have 7 minutes, so we can either do this question or the next question. We can either go through cardinal rules, or is it expensive?
Let's do both.
Let's do both. Yeah, for those baseball fans out there who really like baseball and the White Sox and the St. Louis Cardinals,
you're not helping
real
us
baseball
teams.
Done,
David.
Say what, Mark?
There you go.
There, yes.
Oh, sorry. Did I bore you? I'm talking ball there.
Focus.
All right. So, you know what? I'll let you do that one. I'll let you focus on that.
Apex. So, a lot of times we get the question of, all right, well, how do I get started? How can I be successful in my journey of authoring policies? And there's a lot of moving parts here, but essentially, one, just like any project you're starting, figure out who the stakeholders are, who's important, who are you doing this for? What are they expecting out of it? Get a small team together, because you need to understand your requirements. Again, any project you're taking on, development or otherwise, you need to know where you're headed. Get that team together that knows what you're trying to do. And then once you get that going, you can get started. And when you start doing policies, it's real easy to get a little too complicated too quick. Meaning, like if you're translating authorization requirements from code, you're trying to translate code into our policy. Let's just define your requirements in simple English first. Imagine you're getting them out of the employee handbook. Put them in words like a manager can view all documents, or employees can only view documents that they're the owner of, or that are assigned to their department or their team. Use kind of plain old English to start this discovery process. And a lot of times we kind of see people thinking like, oh, well, I have a lot of work to do, and it's kind of hard to get started. Just like around the house, if I'm trying to declutter my house, it's like, oh, this is going to take me forever. Like, just get started. Pick a room, pick one small use case, and get started on that. But while you're doing it, it's important to keep in mind the bigger goal of what you're trying to do, because that can impact some of your policy structure decisions. So just get started, pick a small use case, get started with that. And again, it'll start to snowball as we get going. And as you start doing that, you may start finding, some baseline cases that apply to every application or every data type. And you can start reusing those and creating common libraries to use over and over again.
Thanks, Mark. So that brings us to the last question, the money question.
I can't believe we made it.
I know, Matt. Incredible.
You've got, I'm going to give you 2 minutes.
Is it expensive? That's actually a good question. Like people, they go, I have my apps, they work well. I don't really want to buy another product or even embark on an open source project. It doesn't have to be buying, a license. You could actually be doing an open source project. I just don't want to do it. I'm doing it inside of my own app. It's good enough, right? We saw that with authentication way back when the likes of Auth0 and Okta, they had to fight that fallacy that I can do it better, right? No, you can't. And it's even truer, I would say, with authentication. Don't ever try to do user management or password management. You're going to make mistakes. Use frameworks, use open source frameworks, use vendor products too, right? It's going to simplify your life. And just to put numbers on that, I was looking for a report that kind of showed how much time a developer normally spends on security-related tasks. I had seen a report 10, 15 years ago from Oracle that said about 20% of a developer's time is spent on authentication authorization tasks. I wanted to see what the number was now. And fortunately, JFrog sponsored an IDC report that puts the number at 19%. And when you translate that into dollar amounts, it's 28,000 US dollars per developer per year, which is not that big of a number if you think about it. It is expensive-ish, but if you have 10 developers, it's only $280,000. I'm really good at math, as you can see. So the cost of doing it yourself is not insignificant, but it's not horrendously huge either. However, the cost of doing it yourself is not the only thing you want to take into account. You also want to take into account the risk that something bad is going to happen, a breach. Either malicious external threat breach or a malicious employee or an employee turned rogue breach. And so I looked at the article that's linked to at the bottom of the slide here. Mark and I looked into those numbers in preparation for this webinar, and the Equifax hack that happened, I want to say about 6 years ago, 10 years ago, I don't remember, time flies, ended up costing the company $575 million. This is not a fine. This is a settlement. And that money is being used to pay back the victims of the hack, right? So, and that does not include, by the way, the cost of fixing the hack. So the development time spent to fix whatever the root cause of the hack was, the cost of the investigation is not included, and the brand damage is not included. So you could easily double the number, right? 575 is just the amount they paid to the FTC to take care of the victims. And if you think $500 million is a huge number, take that number into account. This is a fine that Luxembourg, which if you look at a map of Europe, is a tiny, tiny dot in Europe. It's really hard to place Luxembourg. It's so small. And the fine is so big, nearly $1 billion inflicted on Amazon for GDPR violations. For a country that I don't know the population, but surely not 1 million people live in Luxembourg. So it's a huge, huge fine relative to the size of the country, right? And so this shows that you can't take security lightly. There are risks. There could be brand damage. Of course, when you're Amazon, the brand damage is potentially limited, but it shows that you have to care. And if you think $877 million, Matt, is a small number, then just think about the next one. And that's not even the highest one on that report. I think there was an even bigger one, or there's one in between. There's another $1 billion number.
I think there's a 2-point-something billion.
Yeah, it just keeps. Well, that's when you convert to Canadian dollars, Matt.
Sorry. Yeah, good call.
But Meta was fined in Ireland this time, again for GDPR violations to the tune of $1.3 billion. Now, I don't know about you, but I would not be able to pay that fine. I checked my bank account last night, and it's a little short of the 1.3 billion mark. So that's huge. It's a big deal. So can you really afford not to provide transparency in your authorization, not to provide auditability in your authorization? Because that's what it comes to at the end of the day, right? It's proving that you're doing the right thing. And putting money aside, it's not just doing the right thing for the sake of money and costs and the cost of operations. It's also doing the right thing in terms of the people you take care of, your employees or your customers, and just doing the right thing by them.
Now, David, we are right up against the top of the hour. I gave you 2 minutes. You took 4. So really quickly, just talking about upcoming events.
Yeah, we will be at different events in the next few months. Starting in a couple weeks, we will be in London for the Gartner IAM conference. Come see us. It's a great event. We also have a customer dedicated event on the 26th of March, right after the Gartner conference in London, in Shoreditch at a brewery. It'll be fun. Check our website for details. We'll be tag teaming with Curity, one of our sister companies of sorts. And we'll be talking about the Neo security architecture, applying fine-grained authorization, API authorization, token-based authorization to your architecture. And then Berlin will see us fly off to Berlin. May will see us fly off to Berlin for the European Identity Conference. We're excited to be there once again this year. And then we'll wrap up that cycle of conferences for the first half of the year in Vegas. No, we will not go gambling. I'm not much of a gambler, but we will be talking a whole lot about authorization again. And we will be talking also about OpenID Auth0, one of the latest standards in terms of authorization, of which I'm happy to say Axiomatics is spearheading. We are one of the co-chairs of that standard. Mark, Matt, any other final famous last words?
I'm gonna wrap it up there. As always, appreciate the time with you guys. Appreciate all the questions that have come in. I'm hoping we were able to do them all justice. If you do have other questions, I highly suggest reaching out. Probably the easiest way, as most of you guys are coming through LinkedIn. Reach out to us on LinkedIn. That's the easy way.
We love the questions.
We do love the questions. We can, as you can see, we can talk about this all day long. So appreciate your time and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.